Okay, if you just happen to be tuning in, we're about to start our afternoon panel session with our 6 presenters. Thanks, everybody. So I'm Mike Tobin. I'm been a little bit involved with the planning of this event. I'm a family physician in Fort Collins. Gosh, you've all given us wonderful and a whole lot of things to think about. We have received a lot of questions this afternoon. I have a team behind me, not literally, who's helping file through the questions and feeding them to me. I'd like to start with some general questions for the panel, though there are several that are specific to each individual, and hopefully we can get to those as well. Our plan is to be done right around 4:45 Mountain Time, and then we'll have a couple of wrap-up activities, some thank yous, and we'll be should be off the air by 5 o'clock, again Mountain Time. So again, thank you all for being here. So first question, again for the panel, if you are interested to answer, please do. What is the best way to respond to people who say we need more research to understand the health impacts of oil and gas? Anybody want to start? Abdul, thank you.
I'll go ahead and jump in.
Thank you.
This is a unfortunately common trope in science and medicine, where we assume that nothing is happening in the interim while we're really busy collecting more and more and more data so that we can calculate an effect measure to a third or fourth significant figure. And I find it actually quite deeply frustrating. In fact, it's a big reason why I ended up leaving academia in the first place, because we assume that the world is not happening independent of our research, that we need to know more to act. And my point here is that you wouldn't wait if a patient got wheeled in with a gunshot wound to say, I wonder if this thing is deadly. I wonder if this patient is going to have a seriously bad outcome, right? Because you know that time is ticking. And in the same way that we have adages in medicine, like time is muscle when it comes to a heart attack, I would argue that we need to be thinking the same exact way when it comes to the consequences of both short-term pollution on the health and well-being of populations, and then long-term climate change. And so I don't think we need more research. I think the research has been pretty conclusive. And beyond that, I think we need to think twice about assuming implicitly that the world is not happening independent of our research, that somehow people are waiting for us to get it just a little bit more right tomorrow than we got it today. And in the interim, we need to act.
Yeah, if I may jump in as well, I really appreciate that sentiment. I think that a really important distinction I would make here too is where policy comes in, right? Because I would argue in a lot of cases, it's academics or researchers would love for their research to be used in policymaking. And instead, there are calls for more and more research among a cadre of policymakers, perhaps, who are supported by the very industries that academics are researching, right? So here I would think a really useful term or concept is the precautionary principle that we see used in other societies, right? Where, for example, in the case of oil and gas production, the burden of proof about safety or lack thereof in terms of their production processes and their products will be put on the corporations and the industry, right? Instead, in the cases that we're looking at, the burden of proof is put on people, right? It's put on communities, and this is a common issue with cases of environmental racism and environmental injustice more broadly, where it's up to people to show over and over again that, the cancers they're experiencing or the birth defects they've been victimized by, and all of these things are actually related to environmental contaminants rather than the industries or the economic sectors responsible for those contaminants having to show that their products and their operations are safe. And so I would argue that flipping that narrative right on its head and kind of saying, well, we actually should have complete caution and employ that precautionary principle before these sorts of activities can happen. And this happens in other societies, right? Compared to the US, that would be a really productive way to kind of move in that direction and away from the very problems that you're asking about, right?
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, I was thinking, I was actually going to bring up the same thing, the precautionary principle, because it's something that we just don't see in environmental health. You know, for example, the FDA, before a drug is given to any patient, right, it goes through massive amounts of clinical trials, of research, of, you know, animal models first, and we make sure, you know, over the short term and long term that there's no harm. And then when it comes to environmental pollution, we just kind of throw it out there in the environment and wait to see what happens, rather than kind of looking at what are these compounds that we're putting into the environment first before we even authorize them to be used on the entire population. And it's even, you know, I think a greater harm than, you know, looking at just giving a single drug to a certain patient. We're looking at giving, you know, toxic, you know, particles or pollutants to the entire community. So.
Excellent point. Thank you. Actually, kind of a similar question. You know, research that's been done is mostly done regionally or in a particular area. How much can we utilize that or extrapolate that to other areas, or is it only very specific to where that research is done?
You know, I think I can start. I think it's really tricky right now, especially in regards to fracking and pollutants coming from oil and gas development, because there does seem to be some variability between geographic regions in terms of how much methane is produced and how much VOCs are produced. Also, it depends on how the oil and gas extraction is being done. So it is actually tricky, my understanding at this point, to compare even one site to another. However, I think, you know, there are things that are universally generalizable. For example, like what types of technologies could be used to really monitor and track emissions. And I think that type of technology needs to be rapidly shared across, you know, across states, across international lines and more.
Yeah, I would add to that and say that I agree that there is variability. I think that another important idea here, right, in terms of variability, is the other activities that are going on in the area. So, for example, when we look at northern Colorado and Weld County in particular, it has one of the highest volumes of unconventional oil and gas wells, but also it's, I think, the 6th producing county in terms of agriculture, right? So you have a lot of industrialized agriculture going on, and at some point, it's very difficult to piece apart what's causing what problem in terms of health. And I think that that's another reason to kind of employ this precautionary principle, because at a certain point it becomes the ally of the polluters to keep asking for more evidence, right? To say, well, we just need to know more, because at a certain point it's almost impossible to tease those things apart. And I do think that in relation to some of the institutional context that I talked about in my talk and the mental health impacts, that's a common. I've done research now in Pennsylvania and in Colorado myself, and then there's a lot of emerging research in other places like Texas and North Dakota, where those chronic stress and mental health impacts like depression are common across sites. So some of these social impacts we're already seeing have different, you know, sometimes variation, of course, but common threads from one region to the next.
Thank you. So this is a question for Dr. Helmig. So obviously research is important. We've gotten to this point where all of you and our presenters this morning have given us so much important information. So much of that information has come from research that you and other leaders in the field have done. Detlev, your current research, is very much centered in Colorado, or at least what you've presented the last year or two. And the question has to do with what you see is being measured, not only by yourself, but what's being measured by the producers, by the operators of oil and gas, as compared to what you're measuring, and what maybe the state, maybe the Colorado Department of Health is measuring, and where should we be? What should we be measuring, and how close are we?
Well, it's a lot of questions bundled together.
If anybody else wants to weigh in, please do. But we'll start with that, please.
Yeah, so that's That's a tough one. So most of the monitoring of air quality in the United States has evolved over 50 some years and is following pretty strict protocols that have been defined mostly by the EPA over the years. And they're tailored towards monitoring regional-wide long-term pollution and changes in pollution. Let's think about the acid rain, the radioactivity. We've heard that a few times from, you know, the nuclear testing and so forth. The lead exposure, dioxins, PCB, ozone. So those are programs that run for many, many years. They take slow measurements. The data are usually stored, processed, and then published in reports years and years later. And I don't think that's been hugely valuable for the type of issues we're running in here, because we have local pollution sources where you have point sources, and you have many of them, you know, 25,000 wells or something in a county. And you've seen in some of the data I showed the gradients where you have really high levels and then it drops and drops. So the traditional monitoring networks that have been put in place by the government agencies, I don't think they have been super suitable to answer the community's questions on their exposure to oil and gas emissions and health effects and so forth. And we've kind of filled that hole, at least in this little pocket here in the Front Range in Colorado, where we've implemented a network of multiple sites that are only, you know, 5-10 miles apart, but they already show very big differences in concentrations and exposure. And we're measuring this fast. We're measuring it, you know, at minute to hour time resolution, and we're putting it, making it available to the public and everybody else who's interested, you know, within minutes. And all of that together, I think, has made a huge difference. And I think it has helped understanding the issues, had helped directing policy. And, you know, I think it has set an example to demonstrate how just the monitoring approach by itself can promote much more effective education of the public and the legislators and direct policy. So I think there's, you know, a revolution going on in how this is being approached from applying observation and delivering the information.
Sure, thank you. I think it's fair to say a lot of the guts have been torn out of our regulatory agencies over the last 4 years. I think probably several of you are in a position to comment on this, but there were lots of questions about what we have to look forward to with the next administration. Wondering who would like to jump into that.
I can start on that.
Thanks.
I mean, from my perspective, having looked at chemicals, I'm sorry to say that I'm not that optimistic at the federal level that there's going to be a lot of change, and that's although I do have optimism on these issues generally. What we saw on federal issues under the Toxic Substances Control Act is that it really didn't matter what party was in charge. We looked at records from the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the EPA consistently would find health concerns about chemicals being proposed for use in oil and gas drilling, and then nonetheless would approve those chemicals for use, and they would be used somewhere, usually under trade secret protections. I think it's generally more difficult for regulators and politicians to stand up to the oil and gas industry the higher up the political ladder we go, because they simply represent more people, and it takes more money to push back against the industry. And that's why I think it's really critical that we work at the local level and the state level. And I think, and the success that I've seen on these issues over my career over the last 15 years or so has come more at the local and state level. And I think if we continue to win more victories at those levels, then we can show politicians at the national level that there is the political infrastructure there for them to be able to stand up to the oil and gas industry. And the last thing I'll say is I think that report by the Pennsylvania Attorney General, as well as the regulatory change in Colorado, are very important signals to send to national politicians that there is a real appetite out there for better regulation of oil and gas drilling.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. You know, if you look at what has happened here in Colorado over the last 4 years, there's actually been quite a bit of progress and direction that I think all of us favor, and that has happened during a period where, you know, the government has almost gone the opposite way. Just despite that lack of leadership and direction at the federal level, you know, that we've demonstrated here in Colorado that we've been able to go pretty effectively the opposite direction in several respects.
Right. Dusty, you mentioned, you know, the amount of money that it would take to, you know, direct research and legislation lobbying. What is the role of philanthropy in furthering research or, you know, moving communities in the directions that would be healthiest for them? Philip?
Well, early on, it was a role that hadn't been clearly defined or understood, at least in major areas where philanthropy operates. You know, there's like different ways to think about answering that question. One way is, where is philanthropy? Where is it grant making? There's philanthropy in the Northeast. There's philanthropy on the West Coast, for sure. There's philanthropy across the entire country. Then where is philanthropy within each foundation able to operate? Are they regional or national? And early on, we did when fracking hit the Northeast, we did surveys of not only philanthropic capacity, but also social capacity to activate toward this issue. And it was an interesting progression of awareness and understanding. In the early days in the Northeast, fracking was kind of a one-dimensional issue. It was focused on water. And unless you'd visited the Barnett Shale or been to Wyoming or Colorado and seen the airborne aspects of fracking, it was really hard for people to comprehend that fracking in the Northeast would have an airborne component to it, for example. And then, so there were also notable areas where philanthropy wasn't, but there was large shale formation and development. In the last decade, I think philanthropy has moved considerably into addressing oil and gas issues, as well as the increasingly symbiotic connection between petrochemical expansion using cheap ethane as a feedstock. So the two industries now are aligned for survival. And so philanthropy has been addressing that as well. There's also different aspects to philanthropy. There's so-called climate philanthropy. There's foundations that work really hard on climate change, and they take a variety of approaches to this. One would be to chase methane and CO2 and eliminate its emissions as much as possible. That can be often a highly scientific and technocratic and policy-driven exercise. Another philanthropic endeavor could be to support frontline communities and those who are impacted. You know, a lot of the health effects that we're seeing aren't driven by CO2. That goes without saying. They're driven by many of the compounds that were discussed today. Those are typically compounds that are impacting near field and infield residents. And so there's different sorts of ways to invest in grassroots work, advocacy work, academic work, and policy work to address some of those more immediate concerns. So there's a whole spectrum. But generally right now, I would say philanthropy is very much part of this. And over the last 15 years, it has increased dramatically, the amount of work and grant making in this issue. So that's a good thing from my perspective.
You're here.
If I can add something really fast, and it kind of dovetails with the last question, I think philanthropy is very encouraging and foundation work is necessary and welcome, but I also think it's a symptom of kind of the patterns of neoliberalism in our society since the 1980s, and specifically the deregulation that led to some of the issues that we were talking about with the last question, and the need for more private support of this sort of activity and these sorts of research and concerns now with the lack of federally funded or public support and funding of these kinds of the kind of research that we're talking about and the kind of concerns we're talking about. So I think while it's welcome and it's necessary and it's encouraging to see an uptick in it, I think there's a very specific structural reason why we're seeing that, right? And that's because we're seeing a lack of federal or national level regulations via deregulation and re-regulation of industries. And we're also seeing the privatization of resources across the board, but also the private needs to fund this kind of research that many would argue needs to be funded publicly, right?
I completely agree with that. And I alluded to that point in my presentation, noting the Pennsylvania Attorney General report, where they say other actors had to fill the void. Those other actors were supported not by the government, not by the kinds of risk management institutions that should have been on top of this. And so it begs the question as to, is this the best use of philanthropic dollars? Should those dollars have gone to other issues in lieu of the government essentially not focusing and prioritizing on the issue? I agree with you. Yeah,
especially when we look at those subsidy numbers that Cecilia and other folks were talking about in your presentations, right? Like the public subsidization of these industries versus funding of other kind of research. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of supplement what you were saying, Philip. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to shift over to Cecilia. Dr. Sorensen, you had mentioned, global health concerns related to climate change. What do you see as the most pressing issue? What's the low-hanging fruit? Where should we concentrate first?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think that, in terms of regulating emissions, you get the most bang for your buck when you focus on air quality, because it's something that I find you can talk to general patients about, communities about, and policymakers about, which is that, look, if we decrease emissions from oil and gas development, you're going to see near-term improvements in health. And that translates to public dollars saved in terms of Medicare and Medicaid, and translates just to health all over. And so I feel like, in my work, focusing on air pollution, people can realize that gain a lot quicker rather than saying climate change, because when we say climate change, everybody thinks, oh, that's happening like, in the next century, right? It's too abstract. But I think when you talk about air quality, you can really get more attention. And so that's where I tend to kind of focus my work on. So.
Awesome, thank you.
I'd like to add something on
Detlef, real quick. You want to just adjust your mic? It's rubbing against your shirt there. Just up a little bit.
Okay, hope that's better. So we've talked about and brought up methane leakage and leak reductions from methane. I think we've got to look at this a little bit differently, because it's methane, but what's really doing anything that controls methane controls ethane, propane, butane, benzene, pHs, radon, ozone, secondary particulate matter. So this is not just methane. Methane, we were very worried about it as a climate gas, but all the other species that come along with it, and then they're together. It's not like you have one leak for methane and you have one leak down the pad where benzene comes out. No, they all come out together out of the same leak. That's how natural gas leakage works. So if we control and bring methane leakage down, I would almost say the secondary benefits. They're in another area than the health area, whereas methane is mostly climate area, but the overall benefits are so much higher than just reducing methane leakage. So I would like to encourage everybody to really tackle this as aggressively as possible, because there's so many secondary benefits if you bring methane leakage down.
Absolutely, hear, hear. Next question is for Dr. El-Sayed. Abdul, Dr. Durska earlier talked about how physicians brought change in the state of New York. How would you recommend bringing the medical community on board to bring needed changes that protect the health and safety and welfare of people impacted by fracking?
Yeah, well, I actually want to step back and talk a little bit about physician advocacy generally, right? I think
Great.
Structurally, we are ill-suited for the kind of advocacy that we ought to be able to do as physicians, simply because we've allowed the wrong voices to speak on our behalf for a very long time. If you look at the AMA, who is still seen as the central speaker on behalf of physician interests, they are organized as a guild. They're organized as a guild because in the past, most physicians worked for other physicians. Physicians worked in partnership models in practices. Today, the median physician works in a large healthcare system, and increasingly so. If you look at recent residency grads, they are disproportionately going to these systems simply because it's getting harder and harder to sustain a practice in this environment because of the consolidation capacity of both insurers and providers. And so you can't really work for other physicians anymore. You're not going to assent to partnership. And if you're not owning your own business, you're not a guild. And so what you are is labor. And the fact of the matter is that if you are serious about your role as a laborer, particularly a central laborer in the production of healthcare, then you form a union. And unfortunately, too often in our profession, we have this sort of dissonance about our role in the healthcare system, as if we were still owners of the system. We are not owners of the system. We are extremely high-priced labor. And when you start thinking of yourself that way, you realize that if you were to unionize, your capacity to drive the system in directions that it needs to go, and most importantly, on behalf of your patients, becomes a lot easier. But, I'll be honest with you, other allied health professionals are eating our lunch, whether it's the SEIU and hospital employees, or the NNU, who have been some of the best advocates in healthcare. And we haven't risen to the occasion. And so, if we are serious about advocacy, whether it is about the consequences of fracking, whether it's about the consequences of a profit-driven healthcare system, all of it is better served if we're serious about raising our voices together as a collective and unionizing as physicians. And so I actually think that structurally, there's a lot we can do as individuals. There's a lot we can do through our research. There's a lot we can do as leading professionals in our communities. And we're seeing that through all of our illustrious guests here. But if we were serious about being able to bring power to this conversation, forcing politicians and corporations to pay attention, it would be through our ability to leverage our collective power and unionize. And so I think there's a lot that needs to be done, but I hope that we can think structurally backward and ask, why is it that so much of our effort lacks the kind of power that it really ought to?
Ooh, some heavy food for thought. I'm just wondering, and I'm not trying to plug anybody's book over another or anything, but do you address any of that in either of your books that are out there or coming out?
So not in the first one, unfortunately. The first one's called Healing Politics. The second is called Medicare for All, A Citizen's Guide. And we actually do talk about the role of physicians as a really, really critical arbiter of where our healthcare system goes. Of course, if you look at the history of health reform efforts in this country, physicians have been on the wrong side, at least if you believe that the right side is better care that's more assured for patients. We've been on the wrong side, right? The AMA created the term socialized medicine, and they both destroyed California's effort to do it. They tanked Truman's effort to pass national health insurance. They were on the wrong side of everything from that to the ACA. And we've got an opportunity to be thinking differently. And I actually think that if we are able to get a single payer type health reform in the future, it's going to be because physicians recognize that actually today that kind of effort is in their best interest, both economically and also morally. And so we do talk a little bit about that and about the potential for physicians to collectivize and wield power in the system.
Thank you. Next question is for Dr. Malin. Stephanie, given the evidence for systemic problems with unconventional oil and gas production, what are some other approaches to economic development and energy production, maybe that might level the playing field?
That is an enormous question, and I think it goes well beyond unconventional oil and gas production. I would argue it has to do with economic structures that we've had in place for, you could say centuries or decades in terms of capitalist business models, but the end market systems, but especially since the 1980s, the kind of neoliberal models that I mentioned before. So this kind of very austere version of capitalism where private property, deregulation, privatization of resources, and commodification of everything possible, right, has been kind of a central policy in the United States and various European countries, and it's kind of spread globally through the World Bank and the IMF, right? So looking at the root of the problem, if we're going to talk about structural causes, right, we could say it's the economic system writ large in which unconventional oil and gas before that, right, fit very well. And so that's an important thing for us to think about. I would argue that renewable energy is and there are many technologies included in that umbrella, right, or under that umbrella. But I think that if those kinds of technologies were given the amount of subsidy support and policy support that oil and gas were, for example, that we would have seen exponential growth in those areas, right? We can even look at the pandemic response and in terms of how oil and gas was really supported, whereas renewables were not, and the impacts that has had on renewable energy in particular. One thing that I think though that's really promising to look at, I have a book coming out probably in 2022 looking at different kind of community level responses to more distributive and regenerative systems of agriculture and energy production that are more cooperatively owned and more community owned. So looking at systems that are much more distributive and regenerative, be they food systems or energy systems, are going to really counter those kinds of structural patterns and are key to creating more sustainable systems, be they, whether we're talking about social, environmental, or economic systems, right? Because as many of us know, and we've talked about today already, right, these oil and gas industries tend to be boom bust prone, as do most extractive industries. So the myth that they're bringing in tons of stable jobs to communities is empirically debunked over and over again, right? So looking at more distributive and regenerative systems beyond energy as well is really important. There's an excellent book by an Oxford economist called Donut Economics. Her name is Kate Rayworth, and until my book comes out, we'll plug that one, right, as a really excellent, very concrete model with many examples for how to build systems that are more regenerative and distributive. But I do want to say that, of course, regenerative systems are nothing new, and many native and tribal and indigenous communities have been that's been their life way for centuries, if not longer, right? To have more regenerative systems. So I don't want to co-opt anything there and say this is a new idea. In many ways, this is kind of turning away from colonial and capitalist histories of the last 500 years and returning to more of a, kind of a contemporary version of what that might look like.
There were a couple of comments that came through about the tobacco industry and how, starting in the 60s, research began to come out, but also the taxes, the regulations on the tobacco industry, and then eventually legislation, and how that's, at least for a time, halted the increase in people smoking. Does anybody see any correlations with oil and gas? The comment was, we have to make use of fossil fuels expensive. How do we do that?
Quit subsidizing them. I think that's number one. I mean, if you look at even some of the Department of Defense reports and things like that on how much subsidization is done of oil and gas alone, or fossil fuels more broadly, but oil and gas is key to those. They're on the tune of $400 billion a year. And if you look globally, it's about 2 trillion. The numbers are very difficult to nail down because subsidy numbers are notoriously difficult to access. But, and then we can think about the ways that they're indirectly subsidized through various agricultural subsidies as well, right? So to me, that's a key first step, is you stop giving a safety net to those industries and creating the impression that they're cheaper to use than other forms of energy.
Yeah.
Or on top of that, I mean, you give renewable energy the same subsidies that oil and gas gets. I mean, a lot of this is tax breaks. It's like loopholes in the tax system where they're not paying. And so why can't renewables have the same thing? One thing I was thinking that's been coming up is, you know, a lot of communities where there is a lot of oil and gas extraction, they do say, you know, they want oil and gas because it's jobs, right? And I think, you know, as we're sort of considering, you know, trying to limit oil and gas development, there has to be something that comes in to take the place, whether that be energy or some other type of economic generating activity to help bring those types of communities to an advocacy voice. You know, because I'm sure they're aware of health impacts, but it's that or it's don't have a job, right? And so there has to be a third option. And I think, you know, helping to create that third option is how we're going to win over those areas.
You're here. Thank you for that. Dr. Sorensen, you'd also mentioned, you know, tax breaks and loopholes. There were a couple of comments about the Halliburton loophole. That is not something I'm familiar with, but the comments were that they've allowed unconventional oil and gas development to basically go crazy. Does anybody have any input on that?
Yeah, I've looked at the Halliburton loophole, and I think there's some misunderstanding about the Halliburton loophole. Basically, what this was a provision in the 2005 Energy Policy Act that exempted fracking from the federal Safe Drinking Water Act. And I think my impression is the misunderstanding has been that this affected, or one of the misunderstandings is that this affected disclosure of fracking chemicals. It did not. There's no provision in the Safe Drinking Water Act that required public disclosure of fracking chemicals. What the Safe Drinking Water Act does that did have the potential to affect the drilling industry and better regulate the industry is it required things like the companies had to do a site survey if the law had applied to them around where they were fracking to make sure that there weren't abandoned wells or other vertical conduits that their fracking fluid could rise up toward the surface where it could contaminate groundwater. They also had to conduct pressure tests if the law had applied to them to make sure that their wells didn't leak before they conducted the fracking. And so the George W. Bush administration, led by Vice President Cheney, who had previously served as CEO of Halliburton, one of the largest fracking companies in the world, prioritized exempting the industry, or fracking in particular, from the Safe Drinking Water Act. So they don't have to comply with those safety provisions of the law at the federal level. Instead, it's state laws that govern the safety of fracking. There is an attempt at the federal level to close that loophole called the FRAC Act. And the FRAC Act also includes a provision that would require public disclosure of fracking chemicals at the federal level. One other thing I'll say about the Halliburton loophole is that I think there's some thinking that this one change really sort of wiped away federal regulation of the industry. In fact, the industry has been steadily exempted from federal environmental laws over years. Somebody in one of the presentations mentioned that going back to 1988, the industry was exempted from federal hazardous waste laws that otherwise would require the tracking of cradle-to-grave tracking of hazardous waste, and that those laws don't apply to the oil and gas industry. And there are many other exemptions that have played out over years. The Halliburton loophole is an important one, but it's not the only one.
And if I may add to that, my understanding is similar, right? The oil and gas industry has been exempted from many federal environmental regulations, starting with NEPA and on from that. I do want to say, though, that my understanding, at least of the 2005 Energy Policy Act, of which the Halliburton Loophole is a part, and I've linked to an article there that hopefully everyone can access. If you can't, let me know and I can give you a PDF of it. Is that the Halliburton loophole in particular it wasn't just the Safe Drinking Water Act that the industry was exempted from, but there were several other regulations that, I think it's about 7 out of 15 major environmental regulations that loophole really allowed the industry to have more exemptions from. And I would argue that we can see the fact that that had an impact in that hydraulic fracturing technologies, or the combination of vertical and horizontal drilling, existed for decades before, right? But it was able to boom post that 2005 Policy Act because of that level of deregulation, combined with the kind of questionable sources of funding that came after the 2008 recession. And Beverly McLean has a really interesting article called book called Saudi America that looks at those funding mechanisms. But I would argue we can see the power in the deregulation of that Energy Policy Act, given the kind of lifeblood that gave the industry to use that sort of technology when combined with funding sources after that. So I think it did have an important impact in combination with other factors.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, we've pretty much come to the end of our time for our panel discussion. I really want to thank all of you for all of your wonderful presentations and input.